In the previous video, you discovered the brutal history of Vlad Tepes, the impaler prince who defended Wallachia against impossible forces. But there's a second story equally fascinating, a story about how a real man transformed into the most powerful legend in world horror, how Vlad Dracula, medieval prince, became Dracula, the eternal vampire. This is the story of one of the greatest propaganda maneuvers in history. A story involving three rival empires, the invention of the printing press, and a prince who knew how to use his own crimes as a psychological weapon. Because the truth is this: Vlad didn't become a legend by accident. He became a legend because his enemies needed to transform him into a monster. And then, centuries later, others used that same legend to hide him completely. Today you'll understand how the monster-making machine works, how a man of flesh and blood becomes an immortal nightmare, and why this transformation was so useful to so many different people. Get ready, because this is the anatomy of a legend. To understand how Vlad became Dracula, we need to go back to the year 1408. Europe was literally divided among three titanic forces competing for continental dominance. To the west, the Holy Roman Empire controlled Germany, Austria, parts of Italy, and exercised influence over all of Western Europe. The Germanic Saxons had fortified commercial colonies scattered throughout Transylvania, operating as states within the state. They controlled commerce, trade routes, taxes, and they answered to the emperor in Vienna, not to the local prince. To the south, the Ottoman Empire was at the height of its expansion. Mehmed II, the conqueror, had just taken Constantinople in 1453. The psychological impact was devastating for Christendom. The capital of the Byzantine Empire, which had resisted for over 1,000 years, fell in just 53 days of siege. The Ottomans had cannons that fired stone balls weighing 1,300 pounds. They had a navy that dominated the Mediterranean, and they had an army of more than 150,000 trained men. And in the middle of these two giants, tiny Wallachia, a territory approximately the size of modern Belgium, population estimated at 500,000 inhabitants. Regular army of perhaps 8,000 to 10,000 men when well equipped, against forces 100 times superior on each side. Now imagine ruling this place. You cannot ally with the Christians because they want your territory. You cannot ally with the Ottomans because they want to convert your population. And internally, the Germanic boyar nobles constantly conspire to put puppet princes on the throne. This was Vlad's chessboard. And he knew that survival depended on one thing: strategic terror. Vlad understood something fundamental about asymmetric power. When you cannot win by force, you need to win through fear. But not just any fear, a fear so absolute, so visceral, that it paralyzes armies even before battle begins. Vlad's methods were brutal, yes, but they were also carefully calculated. He didn't impale randomly. He impaled strategically. Traitors were impaled. Spies were impaled. Dishonest merchants were impaled. Invaders were impaled. And always in locations of maximum visibility. When Sultan Mehmed II marched with 150,000 men against Vlad in 1462, what did he find approaching Targoviste? A mile of impaled bodies, 20,000 corpses, the forest of the dead. The Sultan himself, who had seen countless battlefields, who had ordered mass massacres, who had conquered Constantinople over mountains of corpses. This man retreated. His army of 150,000 men retreated before a prince with 8,000 soldiers. Why? Because Vlad transformed brutality into a psychological weapon of mass destruction. But here's the problem. Strategic terror has an expiration date. Eventually, your enemies adapt, or you die, or something worse. And that's exactly what happened. The year is 1462. Vlad has just inflicted a humiliating defeat on the largest Muslim army in history. The Sultan retreated. Christendom should be celebrating its greatest hero. But it wasn't, because something revolutionary had just happened in Europe: the invention of the movable type printing press by Gutenberg, around 1450. For the first time in history, information could be mass reproduced. Pamphlets could be printed by the thousands. And the Germanic Saxons, whom Vlad had brutally attacked, controlled the main printing presses in the region. In 1463, just 1 year after the Ottoman retreat, the first printed pamphlets about Vlad Dracula began circulating throughout Europe. And they didn't talk about his military victories. They talked about his atrocities. Story of a despot named Dracula of Wallachia, published in Nuremberg. How Dracula impaled people and cooked heads. How Dracula spared neither pregnant women nor babies. But here's the crucial detail. The pamphlets were technically true. Vlad really had done these things. The problem is that the pamphlets completely removed the context. They didn't explain that Vlad impaled traitors during a war of survival. They didn't mention that he was facing 2 empires simultaneously. They didn't say that the Saxons themselves had conspired to assassinate his father and brother. The pamphlets presented Vlad as a sadist who tortured for pleasure, a blood drinker, a demon in human form. And Christian Europe, which should have been grateful to the prince who held back Ottoman expansion, began to see him as a monster. Why? Because it was convenient. For the Germanic Saxons, Vlad was a threat to their commercial privileges. For King Matthias of Hungary, Vlad was a competitor for resources from the Pope. For the Wallachian boyars, Vlad was the prince too strong who reduced their power. So they all invested in the same narrative. Vlad is not a hero. Vlad is a monster. The pamphlets spread like fire. Some estimates suggest that pamphlets about Dracula were among the most popular printed materials of the 15th century, more popular even than religious texts in certain regions. And here's what's brilliant about this propaganda campaign. It used Vlad's own acts against him. Each real impalement became proof of monstrosity. Each public execution became evidence of sadism. Vlad had built his defense on strategic terror. His enemies transformed that terror into a political weapon. But the transformation of Vlad into a literary monster took an even bigger leap in the 16th century, when the stories reached Russia. The Russian tales of Dracula presented an even more exaggerated Vlad. In these versions, he didn't just impale. He drank blood, cut off noses, tore out tongues, burned people alive for fun. Why did the Russians intensify the narrative? Because it was politically convenient. Ivan the Terrible, the Russian Tsar, was frequently compared to Vlad. By painting Vlad as an absolute monster, Russian writers could show Ivan as less terrible in comparison. So by 1600 we had a real prince, brutally effective, transformed by propaganda into a bloodthirsty monster. His legitimate military tactics rewritten as pure sadism. But he still wasn't a vampire. This final transformation would take another 300 years. And when it happened, it was for reasons no one could have predicted. Let's fast forward to the 19th century. Victorian era, 1897. An Irish author named Bram Stoker is researching for a horror novel. He wants to write about vampires, creatures that were already popular in the Gothic literature of the time. Carmilla by Sheridan Le Fanu had been published in 1872. The Vampire by John Polidori in 1819. But Stoker wanted something different. He wanted a vampire with historical weight, a vampire that seemed real. And then he found the pamphlets about Vlad Tepes. Here's what we know for certain. Stoker had access to an account of the principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia, written by William Wilkinson in 1820. This book mentioned a voivode of Wallachia called Dracula, who fought against the Turks. Wilkinson also explained that Dracula meant devil in Romanian. Stoker was originally going to call his vampire Count Wampir, but when he read about Dracula, he found the perfect name, a name that sounded threatening in any language, a name with historical weight, a name that already carried centuries of propaganda about monstrosity. But here's the brilliant twist. Stoker practically ignored Vlad's real history. In Stoker's novel, Dracula is a Transylvanian nobleman who became a vampire. He has no clear connection to the historical prince beyond the name and approximate geographical location. Stoker took the name, the reputation for cruelty, and the exotic location. The rest he invented, and it worked spectacularly well. Dracula was published in 1897 and became a moderate success, but the real transformation happened when the story reached cinema. Nosferatu, from 1922, directed by Murnau. An unauthorized adaptation that had to change the character's name to avoid lawsuits. But the vampiric iconography was established. Then came Dracula from 1931 with Bela Lugosi. This film created the definitive image of the aristocratic vampire. Black cape, foreign accent, hypnotic gaze. Lugosi's version earned $10.5 million, a fortune for the time. In 1958, Christopher Lee took on the role for Hammer Films. 9 films over 16 years. Lee brought explicit sexuality to the character. Dracula wasn't just a monster. He was seductive, dangerous, irresistible. And here something fascinating happened. The more films were made, the more distant the historical Vlad became. In the 70s, 80s, 90s, we had hundreds of films, series, books about Dracula. Each version added new layers. Dracula as a romantic anti-hero. Dracula as a tragic creature. Dracula as a Shakespearean villain. Dracula as a sexual symbol. The historical Vlad disappeared completely under layers and layers of fiction. And here's the supreme irony. This transformation into myth saved Vlad from a worse fate. In the 20th century, Romanian communist historians tried to rehabilitate Vlad as a national hero. They published studies showing he fought against invaders, that he protected his people, that he was a victim of Germanic propaganda. But nobody paid attention, because Vlad was now Dracula, and Dracula was fiction. So the real man remained hidden behind the legend, protected by the very imaginary monstrosity that his enemies created. Today, when you say Dracula, people think of black capes and vampire fangs. They don't think of a desperate prince defending a doomed country. They don't think of brutal but effective military tactics. They don't think of strategic terror against overwhelming forces. They think of the vampire. And perhaps, in a strange and perverse way, this was exactly what Vlad would have wanted. He spent his life using fear as a weapon. In the end, he became the very embodiment of fear. Immortal, unbeatable, eternal. So what can we learn from Vlad's transformation into Dracula? First, propaganda works. The Germanic Saxons proved you can destroy someone's reputation simply by removing the context from their actions. Vlad did horrible things, yes, but he did them in the context of a war of survival. Remove the context and he simply becomes a monster. This tactic is used even today. Politicians do it. Media does it. We all do it when we want to discredit someone. Second, myths are more powerful than facts. Romanian historians tried for decades to show the real Vlad. They published documents. They translated letters. They contextualized decisions. It didn't matter. Dracula, the fiction, is more real in people's minds than Vlad, the man. Why? Because myths serve emotional needs. We need monsters to externalize our fears. We need vampires to explore themes of immortality, sexuality, power. Historical Vlad doesn't do any of this. Dracula does all of this. Third, sometimes disappearing into legend is a form of protection. If Vlad had remained a purely historical figure, he would be constantly reevaluated, reinterpreted, judged by modern standards. But because he became fiction, he's protected. Nobody judges Dracula by historical standards. He's a character, not a person. And finally, the line between hero and villain depends on who tells the story. For modern Romanians, Vlad is a national hero. He has statues. He's on money. He's a symbol of resistance. For descendants of the Saxons he massacred, Vlad remains a monster. An example of Oriental tyranny, proof of medieval barbarism. For the rest of the world, Vlad is Dracula, vampire, fiction, entertainment. 3 completely different narratives, all about the same man. The truth? It's probably somewhere among the 3. Vlad was a brutal but effective military leader. His tactics were horrible, but they worked. He maintained Wallachhia's independence in an impossible situation. But the human cost was devastating. He wasn't a pure hero. He wasn't a pure villain. He was human, complicated, a product of a brutal time that demanded brutality to survive. But this complex truth doesn't sell books, doesn't sell movie tickets, doesn't create cultural icons. So we're left with Dracula, the myth, the legend, the eternal vampire, and maybe that's okay. So this is the answer to how Vlad became Dracula. First, political propaganda transformed a prince into a monster. Saxon pamphlets, Russian tales, 300 years building a reputation as a blood drinker. Then, literary genius transformed the monster into a vampire. Bram Stoker took the name, the reputation, the location, and created an icon. Finally, cinema transformed the vampire into an immortal. Lugosi, Lee, hundreds of adaptations, each one adding new layers. In the end, the man disappeared completely. Only the legend remained. And the legend is more real than reality. This is the story of how we make monsters, how we transform people into symbols, how myths defeat facts. Vlad Tepes lived 55 years. He ruled Wallachia for about 9 years total, in 3 separate reigns. He died in 1476 or 77, in circumstances still debated. Dracula lives forever. If you want to understand more about historical figures who became legends, leave in the comments which historical mystery you want me to investigate next. And if you haven't seen the main video about Vlad Tepes' life, the link is in the description. Historians hide fascinating stories, but they won't hide them anymore.